Beginning with 2005's definitive Resident Evil 4, the Resident Evil series on the whole shifted from a slow-paced, dreadful, and tense survival horror genre to an action horror shooter genre that influenced everything from Gears of War to God of War. Resident Evil 4 broke with the wider franchise's conspiratorial sci-fi storytelling by featuring a mystical black-clad arms dealer who spoke in a Cockney accent but was hanging out in rural Spain for some reason.
Got something that might interest you.
This was a far cry from the pure survival horror of the PlayStation 1 era titles, and it's fair to say that every Resident Evil title from RE4 up until 2017's Resident Evil 7 Biohazard took its biggest cues from the critical and commercial success that was Resident Evil 4. 2019's Resident Evil 2 Remake marked a shift in game design principles for Capcom. Combining the third-person POV of the post-Resident Evil 4 titles with the themes of the pre-Resident Evil 4 titles, Capcom forged a stick of gaming dynamite in 2019 that both honored and exceeded the original Resident Evil 2, pleasing old and new fans alike. Just over a year after the Resident Evil 2 remake premiered, Capcom released Resident Evil 3 Remake in the midst of a real-life pandemic caused by the COVID-19 virus. Like Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake is a reimagining of 1999's Resident Evil 3 Nemesis rather than a remaster. In my review of Resident Evil 2 Remake on geeksundergrace.com last year, I wrote, "You're not playing as action heroes, but as regular people thrown face first into an insane situation. Limited controls reinforce RE2's tone." The original RE3 introduced to the series dodge mechanics, branching choices at crucial moments, exploding barrels, and other additions to gameplay. Even in 1999, RE3 was a step toward a more dynamic playstyle overall, shifting away from the sluggishness of the first two installments. Similarly, Resident Evil 3 Remake is a more dynamic approach to the games built in the RE engine. Jill Valentine is a survivor of the Spencer Mansion incident, so she's killed plenty of Umbrella monsters. Prior, she was a U.S. Army soldier and a member of the Elite Stars. Carlos Oliveira is a UBCS mercenary who had to have served in some military in the past. Compared to college student Claire Redfield and rookie cop Leon Kennedy, RA3's playable characters are combat veterans, and the game adapts to this fact. Aiming is quicker and more fluid. Jill and Carlos run faster than Claire and Leon. The reintroduction of a dodge mechanic makes avoiding foes more manageable, and Carlos can literally punch monsters in the face with good timing from the player. The adeptness of the player characters marks a shift in tone that will be pleasing to some and disappointing to others. If Resident Evil 3 Remake were essentially the same game it is now, but produced by an indie developer with no formal connection to the Resident Evil series and no standard of immediate comparison, it would be celebrated as a masterful achievement in all aspects of presentation and gameplay. Subject matter aside, it's a beautiful game. But Resident Evil 3 cannot be interpreted in isolation. It is a remake of an older game, and it exists as part of a larger series with which fans are familiar. Every Final Fantasy game is different, yes, but fans know what they're paying for when they play a Final Fantasy game, and for better or worse, those games are compared to one another. These are the cards studios must play when they choose to make a series. It's true for movies, books, TV, all of it. Resident Evil 3 Remake is a far more cinematic experience than its immediate predecessor, to the point that many of the game's most intense moments essentially force the player to run on scripted rails. Rather than avoiding Nemesis organically, the player simply holds or taps an action button. This happens 3 to 4 times, and it's pure gaming tokenism. Resident Evil 2's Mr. X compared to Resident Evil 3's Nemesis is a microcosm of this entire problem. On my first playthrough of Resident Evil 2 Remake last year, there was a point where Mr. X cornered me in the safety deposit room by the West office, and then patrolled the hallway outside for about 5 minutes, his footsteps booming as he threw open doors in search of poor Claire. I sat there saying to myself, "This is my life now, there is nothing else." Anyway, I hid in the back of the safety deposit room, waiting to hear X's footsteps grow fainter until I mustered the courage to pause the game and go tell my wife what was happening. I did, and she gave me the impatient wife look, so I decided that I am a man, and I would not download the mod that makes Mr. X into Thomas the Tank Engine.
Jesus Christ!
I went back to the game and ran Claire Redfield like a baby to the nearby darkroom to save. Nothing in Resident Evil 3 Remake was at any point comparable to the ridiculous silly dread I just described. Absolutely nothing. The scariest and most tense parts with Mr. X are not the scripted events and boss fights, but his unscripted looming presence, his footsteps banging outside the room you're hiding in, having to plan your route across the RPD in order to avoid him, remembering which windows you boarded up on the first floor because you don't want your gunshots at random zombies to alert Mr. X and possibly draw him to your location. Yes, X is avoidable. Yes, his mechanics are simple once you understand them. But even the most seasoned player is never free from considering the X factor when they play Resident Evil 2 Remake. My assumption when I wrote my review last year of Resident Evil 2 Remake was that Nemesis would be a fiercer, more relentless version of Mr. X. While Nemesis is more dangerous in a straight fight than X, he at no point made me want to download a mod that would turn him into a children's show character. By and large, Nemesis is a scripted threat who attacks at predetermined times. I was never organically chased by Nemesis because I knew that if I tried to run through the donut shop, he would spawn, so I detoured through the alley and only dealt with him during scripted moments, and the game let me do this. This is a tremendous step backward from RE2's imposing and escapable Mr. X. In this regard, it feels almost as if RE3 Remake is the game we should have gotten last year, not the other way around. Tone is an issue in Resident Evil 3. Is it an action horror shooter, or is it a survival horror? It carries plenty of the trappings of a survival horror game, yet many of its core mechanics lend themselves to an action shooter gameplay style. Resident Evil 3 Remake is not a dreadful meditative experience like Resident Evil 2 Remake was. Weapons and ammo abound, exploding barrels and electrical generators are all over the place. The main villain drops goodies when you shoot him up, and both playable characters are combat veterans who know their way around military-grade weapons. And let's not forget this friggin' Sephiroth gun. In order to illustrate the importance of tone to myself, I replayed much of Resident Evil 3 Remake with the music off and also loaded up Resident Evil 2 Remake, doing the same. Having done this back to back, I can tell you that Resident Evil 3 Remake is a much less tense game without music. Resident Evil 2 Remake is just as or even more tense without music. The reason is that the overall tone of RE2 is more dreadful than RE3, which moves through various locations at breakneck speed. The closest comparison to a truly dreadful environment in RE3 is the hospital, but like so much of the game, it's just about over by the time its weight really settles on you because the game is so fast-paced and so short. The length of RE3 Remake is an area of legitimate concern that is not helped by the Resistance multiplayer experience. Some speedrunners have already completed RE3 Remake in as short as 52 minutes. A single campaign of RE2 Remake can be completed nearly as fast, but there are at least 2 campaigns depending on the order of play, with up to 4 slightly different playthroughs and the extra game modes. Resident Evil 3 Remake cuts out at least 2 major portions of the original game that would have lengthened it. Not to mention it doesn't randomize some items that the original did, but it's unfair to judge the game based on what it didn't do that the old one did. Nonetheless, under an hour is under an hour. Even a competent player who isn't speedrunning can finish the game in a few hours, and this is a $60 game at launch. I repeat the points I made about the RE2 Remake here, though now they're more serious. This is a game to be played about once a year. When you understand the mechanics and the jump scares, Resident Evil 3 is rudimentary and not difficult. It's not a game that should be replayed over and over again to get the best time, because to do so negates the experience of playing it. Yet this is what Capcom has always encouraged players to do with these games, creating a dreadful, tense atmosphere with a dark backstory, yet giving players endless rockets and daring them to run past every enemy as fast as possible. On more than one occasion, Resident Evil 3 Remake hints at a Resident Evil 4 remake. The insect-like parasites Nemesis lodges onto the heads of zombies bear more than a passing resemblance to the Las Plagas parasites that drive much of the conflict of Resident Evil 4. A letter from Dr. Barr to the Umbrella European office straight out says that Nemesis is a fusion of the T-virus and an unnamed parasitic organism, which albeit a dollar is RE4's Las Plagas, or something quite close to it. The pale head zombies that appear in the laboratory at the game's end are surely nodding to the creepy regenerator zombies of RE4. For me, Resident Evil is best when it focuses on dread, mystery, and unethical science grounded in plausible events. The games in the series that are burdened with cartoonish tropes are the most lambasted because they're about as convoluted as the plot of Kingdom Hearts. Dr. Marcus is ludicrous. The Ashford twins are ludicrous. Albert Wesker eventually becomes as ludicrous as buff Chris Redfield punching a boulder in a volcano. Capcom realized a few years ago that they needed to go back to their roots with Resident Evil 7, and what followed has been celebrated for a reason. My concern is that Resident Evil 3 Remake hints that Capcom isn't planning to stay the course. It's disappointing that RE3 is over so quickly, that the multiplayer experience is forgettable, that Nemesis is basically a scripted plot device, and that we seem to be, once again, moving in the direction of action shooter horror over and against survival horror. Not all audiences can be completely satisfied with every product, and the Resident Evil series as a whole has worn two hats for going on 15 years. My hope in all of that is that as Capcom continues releasing titles in the reimagined series built on the RE engine, they remember what established Resident Evil in the first place.